Just before we get started with today's video, Mac Weldon, my feet are up on the desk because I'm wearing my ultra comfortable slippers from Mac Weldon. More about those later. But if you want to get great slippers right now, or this hoodie, it's also awesome. Go to macweldon.com, use the code BRAINFOOD for 20% off, and let's get into it. And today we are answering a viewer question because Hail Kasu asks us, what happens when the Queen of England dies? Queen Elizabeth II has reigned over the UK and the Commonwealth for almost 7 decades. But it turns out what happens when she sheds this mortal coil has been planned out in detail, going all the way back to shortly after she ascended to the throne in the 1950s. Indeed, the Queen herself has planned some of the elements. As you might imagine, the whole affair includes an amazing amount of pomp and circumstance, though this was not always the case, or at least not nearly to the extent that we see today in various royal ceremonies. For example, going back to the funeral of King George IV, it is noted in the book Royalty Inc., Britain's best-known brand, dozens of pickpockets arrived in Windsor and lifted watches and money from sightseers who had turned up to see if any celebrities were attending. The funeral itself, hurried through in St. George's Chapel at 9 o'clock in the evening, was largely undignified. The congregation crowded in, jostling for the best seats, and then chatted noisily among themselves. "We never saw so motley, so rude, so ill-mannered a body of persons," the Times' correspondent reported. At least the undertakers were not drunk, as they had been at the funeral of George's daughter and heir, the Princess Charlotte, who died in childbirth in 1817. As for his successor, William IV's coronation, William only reluctantly agreed to have a ceremonial coronation, and the money spent on the occasion was less than a fifth of that expended on his brother's behalf 10 years earlier. Among the other changes to royal protocols, the new king opened the terraces at Windsor Castle and the nearby Great Park to the public access and reduced the fleet of royal yachts. All this, his lack of pomposity and his visceral dislike of foreigners, particularly the French, tended to endear him to the populace. When William IV himself died in June 1837, there was a private funeral at Windsor, and, if not quite as undignified as George's had been, it was a perfunctory affair. The ultra-elaborate, more public ceremonies now associated with the monarchy wouldn't begin in earnest until the late 19th century, in part because of public protest over not being included in many of the events. For example, there was significant backlash over the fact that the 1858 wedding of Princess Victoria and Prince Friedrich Wilhelm had not been more public. As noted in a contemporary report by the Daily Telegraph at the time, the people lamented the growing system of reserving the exclusive enjoyment of state ceremonies and spectacles for particular classes. In 1867, British journalist Walter Bagehot would postulate of all this, "The more democratic we get, the more we shall get to like state and show, which have ever pleased the vulgar." That said, initial efforts to improve things were apparently somewhat lackluster. For example, the eventual Marquis of Salisbury, Lord Robert Cecil, after watching Queen Victoria open Parliament in 1860, stated, "Some nations have a gift for ceremonial. No poverty of means, of absence of splendor inhibits them from making any pageant in which they take part both real and impressive. In England, the case is exactly the reverse. We can afford to be more splendid than most nations, but some malignant spell broods over all our most solemn ceremonials and inserts into them some feature which makes them all ridiculous." Nevertheless, by the time of Queen Victoria's death, things had started to improve somewhat, though this particular funeral ceremony too was almost made ridiculous. You see, while pulling the cart containing the Queen's coffin up a steep hill, a harness on one of the horses snapped, with the result being 2 of the other horses rearing back and buckling. The result of all that, in turn, was the Queen's coffin coming extremely close to being ejected from the carriage. Had it done so, it would have gone careening down the steep hill, possibly ejecting the Queen's body at some point. As for her successor, Edward VII, he would double down on improving public ceremonies, essentially turning every opportunity for pageantry into an elaborate affair and including the public as much as possible. Notably, upon his death in 1910, he had his body placed in a coffin at Westminster Hall, with over 400,000 people reportedly coming to see it, helping to popularly bolster the old practice of certain members of the monarchy lying in state in the UK. This all now brings us to the exact plan for what happens when Queen Elizabeth II dies. Codenamed Operation London Bridge, meetings have been held a few times per year in the over 6 decades since the plan was originally created in order to tweak it as needed with the times, with the overarching plan going over every possible contingency the architects can think of. Beyond logistical plans by the government, in more recent times, British news outlets have also had in place pre-planned obituaries, with some TV outlets rumoured to occasionally rehearse the broadcasts they will give to announce the Queen's death, right down to what they'll wear. If you're wondering, it's a whole lot of black, including black ties for the men, extras of which are actually kept on hand at the BBC. This reportedly became a thing after Peter Sissons of the BBC inadvisably wore a red tie when announcing the Queen Mother's death. Certain members of the general public did not react kindly to this, and if you're curious, you can see how to the practice of wearing black for mourning start. We've got a video on that, I'm going to link to it below. Moving back to the official side of things, to begin with, first, immediately upon her death, the Queen's private secretary, Edward Young, will send a coded message to the Prime Minister with the message originally, "London Bridge is down." However, given the whole point here of using such a coded message is to help reduce the chance of premature leaks about news of the Queen's death, it's possible the exact coded phrase has been changed since that one was discovered. If you're curious, when King George VI died, the code was Hyde Park Corner, and for the death of the Queen Mother, it was Operation Tay Bridge. From there, various entities such as the media will be officially notified, and the radio alert transmission system, RATS, will be activated, announcing the death to the public. That said, it's likely, given social media, that the news will get to the public much quicker than that. This all essentially kicks off a 12-day sequence of events outlined in the plan as D-Day, the day of the Queen's death, with D+1, D+2, etc. representing the following days. Interestingly, this is also exactly the reason the famed military operation, now commonly known as D-Day, is called such. It just stands for Designated Day, allowing for ease of coordinating a sequence of events when the actual start date is unknown, or in some cases where there is a desire for it to be kept as secret as possible. Perhaps the most noteworthy thing of all that will occur on D-Day, besides the Queen's death of course, is Prince Charles will assume the position of king, even though actually being sworn in as king will not take place until the following morning. As for the coronation ceremony, this can potentially take many months to finally take place. For example, Queen Elizabeth II's own coronation after the death of King George VI on February 6, 1952, did not take place until almost a year and a half later, on June 2, 1953. In this case, the decision to wait this lengthy period was made by Winston Churchill. That said, there is some speculation that Charles's coronation will be relatively swift in comparison in order to forestall any momentum building in public sentiment that may push for an abolishment of the monarchy, especially given the relatively lesser popularity of Prince Charles compared to the almost universally loved Queen that he is replacing. To help further forestall such from happening, steps have been actively taken in recent years to try to bolster Charles's profile among his subjects. It should be noted here that Prince Charles may choose not to become known as King Charles III, as he is free to choose any of the names from his full name of Charles Philip Arthur George. From this, there is some speculation that he may wish to honour his grandfather, King George, by taking the name King George VII, or he may go with King Philip after his own father. In any event, after Charles takes the oath the day after the Queen's death, Parliament will be called to session that same day, the evening following King Charles's oath, to swear allegiance to him. Likewise, police and military forces under his rule will also be called, wherever they are, to swear their allegiance to the new king. Also on that evening, the new king will address the nation for the first time in that role. In her own such broadcast, Queen Elizabeth, among other things, swore, "I declare before you that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family, to which we all belong." This is good news because the Queen is essentially above the law, both in her own country as well as pretty much every nation in the world, for reasons that we described in our video on whether the Queen could actually get away with murder. On top of that, from a legal standpoint, their power in their own little empire is almost absolute for a variety of reasons, though of course Queen Elizabeth II has, at least very rarely, used any of this authority. But given this, as you might expect, it's quite important that the person made monarch in Britain is mentally stable and trustworthy, as it would take a literal revolution or rebellion to take such powers away from that person from a legal standpoint, assuming said British monarch did not wish to have those powers taken. This would also place the military, police, parliament, and others in the awkward position of having to very publicly break their sworn oaths to said monarch and take their powers away against their will. Going back to the Queen, what exactly happens to her body directly after her death will depend on where she is at the time, with Operation London Bridge attempting to plan for any contingencies. For example, should she die in her frequent summer home at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, a special Scottish ceremony is planned for her body before it's being sent back to London. In this case, along with appropriate preservation being done, her body will be placed in Holyrood House in Edinburgh for a short time, and then her coffin carried to St Giles's Cathedral, where a service will be held. Then the body will be put on board the Royal Train at Edinburgh Waverley Railway Station, and it will make its way to London, where it will be ultimately placed in Buckingham Palace. Given mourners will likely throw flowers and other things at the train as it passes, plans are in place to have another train follow behind shortly thereafter to clear the tracks as needed before the tracks are put back to general use. On the other hand, should she die abroad, a jet from the No. 32 Royal Squadron will be dispatched with the Queen's coffin to collect her body. And if you're wondering, yes, such a coffin is already made and in waiting in case of a royal's death. Called the First Coffin, it's kept by Leverton & Sons Royal Undertakers for when it's needed. Wherever it's coming from, the Queen's body will, as alluded to, make its way to the throne room of Buckingham Palace and be held there for some time. 4 days after her death, her coffin will be placed in Westminster Hall, available for the public viewing almost 24 hours a day for 4 days. Given approximately 200,000 people went to view the Queen Mother's coffin in 2002, it's expected that the number going to view Queen Elizabeth's coffin will be vastly larger than this. Finally, the night before the funeral takes place, special church services will be held across the UK to commemorate the death of the head of the Church of England. The funeral will then take place the following day, with said day being deemed a national holiday. On that day, the coffin will be carried from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey, where approximately 2,000 guests will be invited into the Abbey to witness the funeral directly, with the service being conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. After that ceremony is over, the Queen will likely be laid to rest in St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Finally, at some yet undetermined point after the mourning period, the coronation of the new king will take place, which will also be a national holiday. As for other logistics, with the change to the new king, various official things like certain physical money, stamps, etc. will switch from Queen Elizabeth's visage to the king's, and an awful lot of official documents and the like that formerly said her and Queen will be switched to him and king, such as the national anthem having the words slightly altered to God Save the King. And all of that is absolutely going to be a massive hassle, unlike getting clothes from Mack Weldon, today's sponsor. Mack Weldon make getting amazing daily men's essentials super easy, and I want to tell you a bit about them before we get into the bonus fact today. Now, you've heard me talk about Mack Weldon before. Indeed, the last time, it was the beginning of the summer, and they sent me a shirt which they said wouldn't get smelly for like a week. I wore it for 8 days, it didn't smell, and it was hot. Now they've sent me more great stuff. You can see me wearing it, some of it today. They've also sent me this great shirt. I actually had one of these already. It was so good. I wanted them to send me another one. I'm also more of a boxer shorts man rather than a briefs man, so I got some of those from Mack Weldon as well. Like, I like the briefs, but I like a bit more like room to move down there, I guess. I got some of those from Mack Weldon as well. It's just better than other stuff. I was always just buying cheap underwear, cheap socks, shirts, hoodies, all of that stuff, but it really matters, and I just didn't think it really mattered. I thought, oh, no one sees it, who cares? Like, slippers I wear in the house, but it does matter. These slippers that I'm wearing right now, there is memory foam in the sole of the slippers. It's insanely comfortable. And look, none of this stuff is cheap, but if you've got a bit of extra money to spend on daily essentials, Mack Weldon is the way to do it. And it's absolutely worth it. You don't know it until you try it. Also, supporting Mack Weldon does support the show, which is amazing. And I also want Mack Weldon to keep sending me stuff. It's really nice. And also, you'll get 20% off. So just go to mackweldon.com, use the code BRAIN, waving the slipper around. Use the code BRAINFOOD to get 20% off. And yeah, just go do it. You won't regret it. It's great. And now let's get into a bonus fact. And I'm going to put my slipper back on. Along with being the only person in the UK to not need a passport when travelling abroad, the Queen similarly doesn't need a driver's licence to drive. This is because, like passports, driver's licences are issued in her name, so she's allowed to simply vouch for her own driving ability should she ever be pulled over. Now, you'd think that given her status and wealth, the Queen would never really drive anyway, but you'd be wrong, though she did a few months ago stop driving on public roads at the urging of her security team, who was worried about the elderly Queen's safety and driving on public roads at her age. But before that, it turns out the Queen loved driving and loved cars. In fact, during World War II, the Queen, then a princess, badgered her father to let her do her part for her country, and subsequently ended up serving as a mechanic and driver with the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service at the tender age of 18. She'd actually registered to serve at the age of 16, but King George wouldn't allow it. The Queen took her position incredibly seriously, becoming, by all accounts, a competent mechanic and driver, trained to fix and drive a host of military and suburban vehicles. Fast forwarding a bit through history, a humorous story about about the Queen's driving prowess comes from 1998, when she was visited at her estate in Balmoral, Scotland, by then Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. The story was later revealed to the world by one-time Saudi ambassador Sharad Karpakol. Knowing Abdullah's stance on the rights of women and the fact that women are essentially banned from driving in Saudi Arabia — there's technically no law that says a woman can't drive, but licenses are only issued to men — the Queen, demonstrating quintessential British passive-aggressiveness, offered the prince a tour of her palace grounds. Dutifully, the prince agreed, and the pair headed outside, where a large Land Rover bearing the royal insignia was parked. After waiting for the prince to climb into the passenger seat, where he no doubt assumed a chauffeur would drive the pair around, the Queen then nonchalantly climbed into the driver's seat and proceeded to drive the car, much to the prince's astonishment. According to Ambassador Sharad, the prince was extremely nervous about this arrangement from the start, and things didn't get any better for him. Then the 72-year-old Queen, knowing that Abdullah had never been driven by a woman before and no doubt observing his anxiety, decided to mess with him by purposefully driving as fast as possible on the narrow Scottish estate roads. As she sped along at breakneck speeds, the Crown Prince screamed at the Queen through his interpreter to slow down and pay closer attention to her driving. The Queen, ignoring his admonishments completely, continued pleasantly chatting away as if she wasn't doing her best Fast and Furious impression. We can only imagine Abdullah's reaction if the Queen had mentioned to him that she never got her driver's license. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do support our show by supporting Mac Weldon and doing yourself a favor as well and getting their fantastic stuff. 20% off if you use Brainfood at checkout. There is a link below. And thank you for watching.